Hello and welcome to the latest Fellside Reflection. Last Sunday in the lectionary, the readings that are set for our services and so on, we began to look at Paul's letter to the Philippians. And in fact, I spoke about that in the last recording that I did last Sunday. And for the readings that are set for this coming Sunday, then the letter to the Philippians continues in chapter 2. And there's just two verses of that I want to concentrate on in this reflection today. But Philippians is what we might call a sparkling epistle of joy. And we need to remember that Paul was in the most depressing situation, really. He's in prison. He's facing persecution for his faith. And yet, almost every section of this letter kind of bubbles with joy. And where our passage begins in chapter 2, then Paul has just talked about developing the mind of Christ as the antidote, if you like, to self-seeking. And he points out how Jesus humbled himself, taking the form of a servant. But after Paul's explained that, it's the next two verses that I just want to concentrate on for the next few minutes. And this is what Paul says, Philippians 2 and verses 12 and 13. Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So, we come now to Paul talking about joy in spiritual growth. And any parent, grandparent, auntie, uncle, we all find joy in the growth of the children in our family. And of course, in the early days as babies, when they're weighed, we're encouraged if they're putting on weight quite normally. And then perhaps as children, every so often, their height can be measured against a chart on the wall to see how much they've grown since the last time. And then we work, we hope, we pray that they will come through troublesome teenage years unscathed. That perhaps they don't get into trouble or develop bad habits or whatever it may be. And we find joy in their growth into maturity. And so likewise, Paul finds great joy in the growth of his spiritual children in Philippi as they grow into spiritual maturity by developing the mind of Christ. So, how were they? How are we to grow into a mature experience of God's salvation? Well, that is where those verses from Philippians 2, 12 and 13 come into it. And we are told to work it out, work out that salvation. And what Paul's saying is that when I'm absent, away from you, then you're on your own. You won't have my physical presence to guide your growth in faith. So grow up and learn to depend on the Lord alone and not on me. And the time comes, of course, when a child has got to become an adult. And they no longer depend upon their parents, but work out their own life to grow from childhood to adulthood. So, work out your own salvation says Paul. Don't depend on me to do it for you. You've got to become spiritual adults. And I suppose to use something of my own experience and being ordained, it's a decent illustration at this point, and perhaps also because in a few days' time, after recording this, our curate Susan will be ordained as priest or presbyter within the church, and sort of go on to another stage of spiritual development. But the thing is, with a curate, when you're in a parish, you are working alongside more experienced people. And as curate, you have a lot of freedom because you don't have the responsibilities, the legal responsibilities of a parish. And you're therefore free to develop new ideas, try new things. Why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And it's great. And when you curate, you can do that, as I say, without certain legal responsibilities and lots of other things beside. And I well remember in my days as curate, 2 churches in the situation that I was in then. And once a month on a Sunday evening after the evening service, we would have basically a youth club. And one day during the summer, one lovely summer Sunday evening, the young people were outside kicking a ball about, running about, and so on. And it was fine. It was a great evening. But then I found out the next day that there'd actually been a phone call of complaint. Somebody complaining about the noise that the young people were making. But the thing is that I'd not actually had that phone call. It was John, the incumbent, the vicar of the parish, who'd received the phone call. And that's what it's like, is the curate tends not to get bothered with things like that. People ring the incumbent up and complain about things. So it was poor old John who had his nice relaxing Sunday night disturbed when he got that phone call. And when we do things in that situation, we have the safety net, of a more experienced person alongside to deal with those quite trivial issues that I've just described, but with the more serious things that come along. But then, after 3 years as a curate, it's time to move on and to finally take responsibility for a parish for ourselves. And then, we're without that safety net, if you like, of someone alongside. That is, of course, unless we go to a team and other people are there and so on. But the responsibility of a parish of our own. And we're then on our own, under God, working things out, working certain situations out, praying for the Lord's guidance and His wisdom. The ultimate responsibility becomes ours. And so as Christians, guides and mentors are very, very helpful, certainly in the early days of ordained life and so on. But then, just as we have to carry the responsibility for a parish, then each and every one of us needs to have responsibility for our own spiritual development, to work at it, to work it out on our own, to work at it in our own life situation. So we need to work out our own salvation, our own growth in faith, without the assistance of a Paul, or a Gary, or a Steve, or a John. We learn to depend on God alone to lead us to guide us. So, on our own, we're responsible for our own spiritual growth, for our own spiritual growth, I should say. But we're not on our own, for God is at work in us. And by His Spirit, all the divine energy, so to speak, is working in our life, guiding, prompting, as we work out our spiritual growth, as we mature in faith. And so I'll close with the words of St. Augustine. And it was Augustine who said, "Work as if all depended on you, and pray as if it all depended on God." And so, very apt words, I think, to finish. To be responsible for our own spiritual growth and to actually take responsibility for that, our own Bible reading, our own prayer life. We can't rely on others. So, as Paul says, a reminder of those verses, "Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for His good pleasure." So, as I say, we have that reading there from the epistle. It has been described as this sparkling epistle of joy. Paul's in a very difficult situation. He's under house arrest. He's serving, he's in prison, house arrest. He's suffering for his faith. And yet almost every section of this letter to the Philippians kind of bubbles with joy. And so we look at Paul, we look at that example, and no matter what the circumstances, it's we personally who are responsible for our own spiritual growth and development. And if we read earlier, you may want to go back and read the first few verses of Philippians 2, where Paul speaks about developing the mind of Christ and using the example of Jesus. He humbled himself and came in the form of a servant. And from that, we move on and we grow in faith. So we are responsible for our own spiritual development. And Paul, as I say, speaks with joy at various places. So he finds joy in these people and their growth in faith. Because, as he'd said in chapter 1, with him being absent from the churches that he'd founded and planted and so on, people actually had to grow in faith. They had to take responsibility. They had to do things. And as they do that, and as these people grow in faith without Paul, the mentor, the spiritual advisor, he finds great joy in their growth in faith. But he stresses that each and every one of us are responsible for that growth. And so I'll leave you with those words, that reflection. And as always, until the next time, bye for now.